The night had started like any other at the small neighborhood bar. The kind of place where people came not for fancy cocktails or loud music, but for a quiet drink and some company after a long day. The walls were lined with faded photographs of past patrons, some holding beers with wide smiles, others in old military uniforms that told stories of a life once full of service. The lighting was soft, just enough to see the faces around, but dim enough to hide a few secrets. He walked, and quietly nodding to the bartender, a familiar face who had known him for years. The bar was busier than usual, a mix of local workers, a few veterans like him, and some regulars looking for a late-night escape. He chose a corner booth, away from the loudest crowd, and ordered a simple drink. The kind of drink that doesn't ask for attention, just lets you take a breath and forget the chaos of the world outside for a while. As he sat down, taking in the low hum of conversation and clinking glasses, he tried to let go of the tension that had been building all week. Work had been stressful, life had been complicated, and tonight all he wanted was a little peace. But peace, he was learning, wasn't something everyone could respect. Across the room, a man noticed him. Not just any man, someone who had served in the military too, recognizable by the old insignia on his cap and the way he carried himself. But unlike him, this man had bitterness written all over his face. His eyes narrowed, scanning the room, and finally they landed on him. Something about the way he held himself calm and composed seemed to spark a flicker of anger in the other man. The man started with words, careless and sharp, aimed to sting. "Look at you sitting there like you own the place," he said loudly, enough for nearby patrons to turn their heads. There was a sneer in his voice, a tone that carried more than just irritation. It carried prejudice, a hatred that didn't need an explanation. At first he ignored it. He had learned long ago that some people were quick to speak but slow to listen. Some people needed to feel their own frustration before they could move past it. He sipped his drink, keeping his eyes on the glass, trying to let the words pass like smoke in the air. But the man didn't stop. He leaned closer, pointing a finger now, shouting over the music and the chatter. "Don't think you're better than anyone else just because you served." The words hit harder this time, sharp and deliberate, meant to provoke. A few people around them exchanged uneasy glances. The tension in the room began to rise, subtle at first, like the tightening of a spring ready to snap. He finally looked up, slowly, deliberately. His expression was calm, but there was a weight behind it, a weight of years of experience, of knowing how to handle situations like this. "I'm not trying to be better than anyone," he said evenly, his voice low but firm. "I'm just here to enjoy a quiet evening, like anyone else." The man laughed, a harsh, bitter sound that made some nearby patrons flinch. "Quiet evening?" he mocked. "You think you belong here, huh? Sitting in your corner, pretending everything's okay?" His words were laced with venom, and with each sentence he took a step closer, his body tense and aggressive. It didn't take long before the insults escalated. They weren't just words anymore. They carried intent. The man shoved him lightly, at first testing the reaction, but the shove was enough to make the surrounding patrons tense. Conversations paused, drinks were held a little tighter, and the low hum of the bar was replaced by the sudden awareness that something could go wrong fast. He didn't push back, not yet. Not a single muscle betrayed anger. Instead, he took a slow breath, letting the tension roll off his shoulders. His military training had taught him to stay composed, to not let emotion dictate action, especially in situations where others were trying to provoke a fight. The man saw the calm, expected submission, but what he got instead was a quiet strength that made him hesitate for a fraction of a second, a fraction that made the bar hold its collective breath. "Listen," he said, voice steady. "I don't want trouble. Just leave me alone and we can both enjoy our night." The man scoffed, clearly unused to being talked to with such calm authority. "Leave you alone?" he snapped. "You think you can tell me what to do?" His hand shot out again, this time pushing harder, slamming against the table. The sudden force made a glass wobble, threatening to spill, and nearby patrons instinctively moved back, unsure whether to intervene or just watch. Even now, he didn't retaliate. He leaned slightly to the side, letting the shove lose its power, and placed a steady hand on the table, not to strike but to stabilize himself. His eyes met the man's, not with hate, not with fear, but with a quiet intensity that spoke louder than any threat could. It said, "I am not afraid. I will not fall to anger. I am still in control." Some of the patrons started whispering, "Wow, he's not even fighting back. That guy's crazy, look at him." "He's calm, too. Calm." The murmurs spread like wildfire, each person analyzing the scene differently. Some admired the restraint, some feared the potential for violence, and some simply watched, waiting for the inevitable explosion. The man finally paused, breathing heavily. There was confusion in his eyes. He expected resistance, expected fear, maybe even submission, but not this. Not a quiet, unshakable composure that seemed to radiate a power he couldn't understand. And that was when he did something that made everyone gasp. He threw a punch. It wasn't a calculated strike. It was wild, fueled by anger rather than skill. But he missed. The way he swung, he overextended himself, leaving his balance awkward and off-kilter. The bar collectively flinched, bracing for the moment when chaos would break out. But he didn't fight back. Not yet. Instead, he stepped aside with a subtle movement, almost graceful in its simplicity, letting the punch pass harmlessly by. He didn't even flinch. The calmness in his eyes didn't waver. The bar had never seen anything like it. An entire room frozen in disbelief at a scene that could have easily turned ugly. Some patrons started speaking up, voices shaky but firm. "Hey, knock it off. Come on, man, enough." Others reached out instinctively, standing up from their stools ready to intervene if necessary. The tension hung thick in the air, like a storm ready to break, but he remained the eye of it, steady, calm, unmovable. The man, now realizing that his aggression was met with unexpected control, froze for a moment. His anger hadn't faded, but it was tempered by the strange, unspoken authority he was facing. He didn't know what to do next. Around him, the bar waited, silent but alert. The usual sounds of chatter and laughter had vanished, replaced by the hum of anticipation. And then, he said nothing. He just stood there, chest heaving, trying to collect himself while he simply sat, calm and unshaken, continuing to sip his drink as if nothing had happened. The sight was powerful. Everyone in the bar felt it. There was tension, yes, but also admiration, a recognition of self-control that few could ignore. It was in that moment that the story of the night began to take shape. It wasn't about the aggression or the anger or even the insult. It was about restraint, about maintaining dignity in a situation that could have easily spiraled into chaos. It was about a quiet power that doesn't need to shout to be heard. And though the first part of the night ended without further violence, the air in the bar had changed. People had seen something that left an impression, a reminder that sometimes strength isn't about hitting first, but about standing firm when others try to knock you down. The confrontation had begun, but it was clear that the real story was just beginning. The night was far from over, but the atmosphere in the bar had changed. What had begun as a simple evening of quiet drinks now felt heavy with tension. Everyone could sense that something had shifted, even if they couldn't quite put their finger on it. The man who had been aggressive earlier leaned against the bar, muttering under his breath, clearly frustrated that his anger had not led to the result he expected. He sat quietly, his posture calm, yet every eye in the room could see the energy in him. The kind of quiet confidence that comes from someone who has faced real challenges in life. It wasn't arrogance, nor was it fear. It was experience, discipline, and the understanding that anger rarely solves anything. The kind of understanding that could only come from years of facing tough situations and knowing how to stay grounded. The aggressive man's anger hadn't disappeared. If anything, it had grown more volatile because it was not being met with fear or retaliation. His words became sharper, directed at anyone who dared glance at him. "You think you're untouchable, huh? He shouted toward the empty space where he expected his target to rise and fight. "You think you can just sit there and laugh at me?" But there was no laughter, only calm. He continued sipping his drink, his eyes steady, never leaving the man entirely but refusing to rise to the bait. Every movement he made was measured, deliberate. Each subtle gesture sent a quiet message. "I am in control. I am not your enemy, but I will not back down." Some patrons began whispering again, the hushed tones creating a ripple through the bar. "He's not reacting. That's incredible. I've never seen someone handle a situation like this. What is he doing? He's just calm." The murmurs reflected a mix of admiration and tension. They were watching someone who seemed untouchable in the face of aggression, someone who made even the loudest, angriest person pause and reconsider. The man who had started the confrontation took a step forward, swinging his arm in frustration. This time it wasn't a punch. It was more like a threatening gesture, a test of patience. He leaned closer, trying to intimidate, but the calmness across from him didn't waver. Each second stretched, heavy with anticipation, as if the bar itself was holding its breath, waiting for the inevitable clash. Then, something surprising happened. A few other veterans who had been sitting quietly in a corner, enjoying their drinks, noticed the tension and decided to step in. They weren't there to fight, but to intervene, to make sure things didn't spiral out of control. Their presence was subtle at first, a few words spoken firmly, a gentle hand on the shoulder, a reminder that some battles weren't worth fighting in the heat of the moment. "Hey, calm down, man," one of them said quietly but firmly, his voice carrying the authority of someone who had been through similar conflicts. "This isn't the place for this. Step back." The aggressive man glared, clearly annoyed, but the intervention caused him to hesitate. No one had stepped in before. Everyone had just watched. But now, with the presence of others who understood the weight of action and the value of restraint, he paused. The silence that followed was thick, almost tangible. He didn't take his eyes off the man, but his posture softened slightly. There was still anger, yes, but the edge had dulled just a fraction. The realization was starting to sink in. His aggression alone would not dominate this situation. It wasn't a battle he could win with fists or insults. The calm man took this moment to speak. His voice was low but carried across the bar not as a threat but as a statement of truth. "I didn't come here to fight anyone," he said. "I came here to have a quiet drink. If you want to leave this place peacefully, you can. If you want trouble, you'll get nothing but regret." The words hit differently. There was no anger in them, only a quiet authority that made the aggressive man falter. He had expected fear, maybe a defensive reaction, perhaps even a fight, but not this calm, unwavering stance. There was something in the eyes that made him question himself, a quiet power that didn't demand respect, but naturally commanded it. Around them, the bar felt electric. Patrons were leaning slightly forward, curious, some afraid, some in awe. Conversations had stopped completely in certain areas, replaced by the unspoken understanding that something important was unfolding. It wasn't just about a personal conflict anymore. It was about human strength, about the power of restraint, about the ability to remain steady when chaos surrounds you. The aggressive man muttered under his breath, pacing slightly. His hands clenched and unclenched as he wrestled with his own frustration. He wanted to lash out, to assert dominance, to make someone fear him. But every time he tried, he found the calm presence before him unmoved, unaffected, unshakable. Few more veterans moved closer, forming a loose circle around the two men, not to intimidate but to create space and prevent escalation. Their silent presence sent a message. This is a community. This is a space where recklessness doesn't go unchecked. The aggressive man realized he wasn't just facing one person anymore. He was facing an entire room that silently expected him to act with reason, to respect the environment and those around him. Finally, after several tense minutes, the man stopped pacing. He leaned against the bar, his chest rising and falling heavily, his face flushed with frustration. The room was quiet now, every person acutely aware of the tension and waiting to see what would happen next. Even the bartender, who had seen countless arguments over the years, paused to watch, sensing that this was more than just a bar fight. It was a lesson in control and patience. The calm man didn't move toward him. He didn't raise his voice. He simply continued sitting, sipping his drink, maintaining the same quiet authority that had prevented the situation from exploding. His restraint was almost painful to watch. He could have retaliated at any moment, could have used his strength to dominate the aggressive man, but he chose not to. That choice, more than anything else, shifted the energy in the room. It was, in that moment, that the aggressive man realized something. His anger, which had fueled him for minutes, was useless. The person he intended to provoke was untouchable, not because of fear, but because of self-control. And self-control, he understood, reluctantly, was a far greater power than brute force. The bar slowly returned to a semblance of normality. Some patrons resumed their drinks, but others couldn't look away. The tension had not fully disappeared, but it had changed form. It was no longer fear of what might happen. It was admiration, a quiet respect for someone who could maintain composure in the face of provocation. The aggressive man muttered a few words, half to himself, half to the room. But no one responded. It was clear that whatever confrontation he had hoped for would not come tonight. The lesson, whether he wanted to accept it or not, had already been delivered. Anger without control is meaningless. Authority without aggression is powerful. Even as the night wore on, the calm man remained seated, composed, sipping his drink, occasionally glancing at the other man to ensure the tension did not return. He didn't gloat, didn't celebrate, didn't demand acknowledgement. His presence alone was enough to command attention, to show that strength is often silent, and that sometimes the greatest victories are those won without a fight. By the time the bar started to thin out and the hum of conversation returned, the memory of the confrontation lingered. Patrons would remember the night not for the threat of violence, but for the demonstration of human dignity, patience, and moral strength. And the aggressive man, though still fuming inwardly, knew he had been confronted with something larger than himself, a quiet power that would stay with him long after he left the bar. The night wasn't over, but the first major test had passed. What began as a potential fight had transformed into a lesson, a moment of reflection, and a subtle shift in how everyone present viewed strength, respect, and control. And though no one clashed violently, the memory of the confrontation would linger, a reminder that sometimes courage is measured not in punches thrown but in patience maintained, calm preserved, and dignity upheld. The tension in the bar had been thick for nearly an hour, and even though the aggressive man had calmed down slightly, the room still felt heavy. Patrons kept stealing glances, some whispering quietly, trying not to draw attention. It was clear that the confrontation had left a mark. But while most people were frozen in observation, a few veterans who had been sitting quietly in the corner finally decided it was time to act, not with anger, but with reason. They approached carefully, not trying to escalate anything, but simply to create space and authority around the situation. Their eyes met his, steady, calm, but firm. The aggressive man's fists were still clenched, his posture defensive. He was ready for a fight, even though he had no real idea who he was facing. The calm man remained seated, hands on the table, unshaken, as if the chaos around him barely existed. "You need to step back," one of the veterans said quietly, voice carrying the weight of experience. "This isn't the time or the place. You've done enough." The man snapped his head toward the voice, his anger flaring briefly, but he found himself facing not just one person, but a few veterans who had served in the same way he had. People who understood what it meant to hold themselves accountable and respect others. That sudden realization made him hesitate for the first time all night. The calm man took advantage of the pause. He didn't speak loudly or angrily. He didn't accuse or insult. He simply leaned slightly forward, making direct eye contact, and said, "I'm not your enemy. I came here to relax, just like everyone else. If you want to leave this alone, you can. If not, It's your choice what happens next. There was a strange silence that followed, heavy with expectation. The words were simple, but they carried authority and truth. They weren't words meant to intimidate. They were words that demanded reflection. Everyone in the bar felt the shift. Even the aggressive man's own friends started whispering, their faces showing concern. They had come expecting a fight, but instead they saw restraint and confidence they hadn't anticipated. For several tense moments, the aggressive man stood frozen, unsure whether to attack, to walk away, or to lash out. Verbally again, his chest rose and fell heavily, frustration and pride warring within him. The veterans nearby didn't move threateningly, but their presence added weight. They were silent reminders of order and experience, of the consequences of impulsive actions. Finally, he raised his voice, still loud and harsh, trying to regain control of the situation. "You think you can just sit there and lecture me?" he shouted. "You don't know me. You don't know anything about me." The calm man simply shook his head slightly, his eyes unwavering. "I don't need to know you," he said, voice even and firm. "All I need to know is that everyone here deserves respect. That's all I care about." The words, so simple yet so powerful, hit harder than any punch could. The aggressive man faltered, unsure how to respond. His anger had no outlet here. No one was intimidated. No one was afraid. Every punch he might throw, every insult he could shout would change nothing, and that realization made him take a step back, physically and mentally. Then, something unexpected happened. One of the older veterans who had been watching quietly for most of the night finally stepped forward. He wasn't there to fight nor to lecture. He just looked at the aggressive man squarely in the eye and said, "You've been a soldier just like us. Do you really want to throw that away over a stupid argument in a bar? We've all been trained to face challenges. But strength isn't just about fighting. It's about knowing when to stand down." The words cut deeper than any insult or threat could. The aggressive man blinked, his chest heaving, as if trying to digest them. He had been ready to dominate, ready to prove something, but suddenly the perspective shifted. He was no longer just angry at the calm man. He was confronted by veterans who reminded him of the values he had once held, the principles that had guided him through service and life. The room seemed to hold its breath. Patrons who had been quietly observing were now leaning in, sensing the turning point. The bar, once filled with the low hum of conversation, had become a stage where restraint, patience, and authority were on display. And at the center of it, all was the calm man, still seated, still composed, his gaze steady, his voice unwavering. The aggressive man's hands, which had been tightly clenched for so long, started to relax slightly. His shoulders sagged, the tension in his posture slowly easing. For the first time that night, it seemed like he was considering an alternative to anger. He opened his mouth, ready to shout or argue, but the words didn't come. Instead, he looked around, at the veterans who had intervened, at the patrons who had silently supported restraint, and finally at the calm man who had refused to fight. The realization was slow, but undeniable. He had been outmatched not by strength, but by self-control, by dignity, by the kind of calm confidence that can't be provoked into recklessness. Few minutes of silence passed, heavy but transformative. The bar seemed to breathe collectively, relieved that a fight had not broken out, but also impressed by the display of courage and restraint. The aggressive man shifted uneasily, muttering something under his breath that no one could hear clearly. His anger was still there, but it was tempered now, restrained by the realization that acting on it would achieve nothing. The calm man finally spoke again, softly this time, almost as if speaking to himself, but loud enough for the aggressive man to hear. "We've all faced battles, but this isn't one of them. There's nothing to prove here, just respect, and that's enough." The words were like a mirror, reflecting back the aggressive man's own actions. He felt exposed, not humiliated, but confronted by truth. For the first time that night, he understood that the fight he wanted wasn't necessary, that sometimes the real strength is in holding back, in choosing not to react, in showing courage through restraint. The patrons, now realizing the intensity of what had unfolded, began to settle down. Conversations resumed, though more quietly, more thoughtfully. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others whispered in admiration. The scene had transformed from a potential brawl to a lesson in human character, a demonstration of the power of patience and moral courage. Even the aggressive man's friends started to murmur quietly among themselves. They had expected chaos, expected dominance, expected a show of aggression, but instead they saw calm, authority, and respect. They exchanged glances, realizing that their night had taken an unexpected turn, one that left an impression they would not forget. The aggressive man's face softened slightly, though his pride still showed. He took a small step back, no longer advancing, no longer threatening. The tension in the room eased, but it didn't disappear entirely. Everyone knew the night wasn't over, but a turning point had been reached. The confrontation was no longer about anger or dominance. It was about reflection, about understanding, about the quiet power that can change the course of events without a single punch being thrown. Finally, after several long minutes, the aggressive man muttered something that no one fully caught, and he stepped away from the table. He didn't leave the bar, but he stopped confronting anyone, moving to a corner to collect himself. The bar exhaled collectively, the atmosphere shifting from fear to relief, from tension to admiration. The calm man continued to sit, quietly sipping his drink, eyes occasionally following the aggressive man, but never with malice. His presence had changed the course of the evening, and though nothing physical had occurred, something far more significant had taken place. He had shown everyone in the room, including the aggressive man, that true strength isn't measured by aggression or dominance, but by restraint, dignity, and the ability to remain composed when provoked. By the end of the night, the patrons had returned to their conversations, though now laced with thoughtful reflection. The bar had witnessed more than a confrontation. It had witnessed a demonstration of human character at its finest. The aggressive man remained in the corner, quietly thinking, clearly affected by what he had experienced. The lesson was there, unspoken but undeniable. Respect and self-control could be far more powerful than anger or violence. And as the calm man finally stood to leave, he nodded quietly to the veterans who had intervened and to the bartender who had silently supported the peaceful resolution. The night wasn't over, but a moment of transformation had occurred, one that would linger in the minds of everyone present long after the lights went down. The bar had finally begun to calm, but the atmosphere was still charged with the energy of what had just happened. Patrons were slowly returning to their drinks and conversations, though many still stole glances toward the corner where the aggressive man had retreated. The tension of the night had not fully disappeared. It had transformed into a quiet reflection. People were thinking about what they had witnessed, about the restraint, patience, and authority that had kept the situation from spiraling into chaos. The calm man sat for a moment longer, observing the room, letting the reality of the night sink in. He didn't raise his voice, didn't seek recognition, and didn't act triumphant. His presence alone had commanded respect, and now he realized the next step was to address the one person who had caused so much tension, not with anger or judgment, but with honesty. He slowly stood and walked toward the aggressive man, who was still leaning against the wall, hands in his pockets, staring at the floor. The man's chest rose and fell rapidly, a mixture of frustration, confusion, and something that looked suspiciously like guilt. Patrons watched quietly, unsure of what would happen next. "Look," the calm man said, his voice steady but gentle. "I'm not here to fight you. I'm not here to humiliate you. I just want to make one thing clear. Respect goes both ways. You don't have to like me, but you do have to recognize that everyone deserves basic human dignity. That's all I've been asking." The aggressive man stiffened, his head snapping up for a brief moment, meeting the calm man's gaze. For the first time, there was no shouting, no anger, just recognition. The words were simple, but they carried weight, cutting through the noise of ego and pride that had fueled his actions earlier. I don't know," he muttered, his voice low, almost uncertain. I didn't think His words trailed off, as if he couldn't finish the sentence without admitting something he had been avoiding all night. The calm man nodded slowly, understanding that this was more than just an apology waiting to happen. It was a moment of reflection, a turning point where the aggressive man had to confront his own behavior and choices. "It's okay to feel that way," he said. "We all make mistakes, but it takes courage to acknowledge them, to step back and say, 'I could have done better.' That's the real strength. That's what changes things." For a moment, the aggressive man remained silent. His eyes darted around the room, taking in the patrons who had witnessed the night's events, the veterans who had intervened, and the calm man who now stood before him, unwavering. He realized that the entire room had silently expected him to act with reason, to step up and show humility, and that expectation weighed heavily on him. Finally, he spoke again, more clearly this time. I didn't want to cause trouble," he admitted, his voice raw with emotion he had been holding back all night. I guess I let my anger take over. I didn't think about anyone else." The calm man's expression softened, slightly, but he didn't smile. He remained composed, letting the words land where they needed to. "That's all I'm asking," he said. "Just think about your actions. You don't have to like me or agree with me or even forgive me. Just think about what respect means, not just here, not just tonight, but in general. That's the lesson." The aggressive man's shoulders sagged slightly, a subtle release of the tension that had held him up all night. For the first time, he seemed smaller, not in a physical sense, but in a mental and emotional way. He realized that all his anger, all his attempts to dominate, had accomplished nothing. In fact, it had made him feel weaker, exposed and unbalanced. The calm man continued speaking softly, almost like he was guiding him rather than confronting him. "We all carry anger, all of us. It's natural. But what we choose to do with it, that's what defines us. You can let it control you or you can control it. Tonight you have a choice. You can leave this place the same as you came in, or you can leave knowing that you took responsibility even in a small way. That choice belongs to you." The aggressive man looked down, taking a deep breath. It wasn't an easy thing for him to do, admitting fault, accepting guidance, facing the consequences of his behavior. But he could feel the weight of the calm man's words. They weren't insults. They weren't attacks. They were truths, simple and undeniable. And he realized that the night didn't have to end in humiliation or shame. It could end with reflection, with growth, if he chose it. He finally nodded slowly, almost reluctantly but sincerely. "You're right," he said. I should have handled this differently. I'm sorry." The bar seemed to release a collective sigh, as if the tension that had gripped the room for hours had finally begun to dissipate. Patrons who had been holding their breath relaxed slightly, some smiling quietly, some shaking their heads in disbelief at what had unfolded. The aggressive man's admission wasn't just a personal moment. It was a transformation witnessed by everyone in the room. The calm man nodded, a subtle acknowledgement of the effort it had taken. "Apologies are a start," he said, "but it's what you do after that matters. Actions speak louder than words. Show people who you are through your behavior, not just your words." The aggressive man listened, absorbing the advice. He realized that the night had offered him something unexpected, a chance to reflect on himself, to see his own weaknesses and how they had affected others. He had entered the bar ready for confrontation, ready to assert dominance, ready to prove something to himself and the world. And yet, by the end of the night, he was learning the real lesson. True strength isn't shown through force or intimidation. It's shown through control, through humility, through the courage to do the right thing even when it's hard. Around them, the bar slowly returned to a quieter rhythm. Conversations resumed, laughter crept back into corners, and glasses clinked once more. But the memory of what had occurred lingered in the minds of everyone present. It wasn't just a lesson for the aggressive man, it was a lesson for everyone. A reminder that in life, confrontation doesn't always lead to resolution, that sometimes the most powerful moments are those where restraint, dignity, and moral courage prevail. The aggressive man stayed in the corner a few more minutes, collecting himself, before finally moving toward the exit. His steps were slower, more thoughtful than when he had entered. He glanced back once, meeting the calm man's eyes again. There was no anger left, only understanding. A silent acknowledgement that this night had changed him in some way. The calm man returned to his seat for a moment, finishing the last of his drink. He didn't seek praise, he didn't demand attention. He simply allowed the moment to exist, to settle, to leave its impact naturally. That was all he needed to do. His role had been to show what courage and restraint could look like, and he had done so without fanfare, without aggression, without needing to prove anything. For the patrons of the bar, the night had become more than just a night out. It had become a story they would remember, a story about the power of patience, about the lessons learned when people are forced to face themselves, and about the quiet strength that comes from doing the right thing even when it is difficult. As the last few customers left, the calm man stood up, nodded to the bartender, and left as quietly as he had arrived. Outside, the night air was cool and crisp, carrying with it the sense of resolution that had settled over the bar. The aggressive man's footsteps echoed softly behind him, a reminder that while the confrontation had ended, the impact of the night would last far longer. And in that quiet reflection, the true lesson of the evening became clear. Sometimes, the greatest victories are not about winning a fight or dominating an argument. They are about understanding, restraint, and the courage to guide others toward the right path, even when it is uncomfortable. That night, everyone present had witnessed that power firsthand, and the memory would stay with them long after the lights of the bar had dimmed. The bar had finally returned to its usual rhythm, but the energy of the night still lingered. The events that had unfolded were on everyone's mind, even if they didn't speak of them aloud. Patrons sipped their drinks in quiet reflection, occasionally glancing at the corners where the confrontations had taken place, remembering the tension and then the surprising calm that had followed. Outside, the night was cool and still. The streets were empty except for a few late-night wanderers, but inside the bar, the impact of the evening remained alive. It wasn't about the drinks, the music, or the chatter anymore. It was about what had happened, about lessons learned, and about how one person's composure could ripple through a room and change the outcome of a tense situation. The aggressive man had left the bar quietly, his steps slow and deliberate. He walked through the empty streets, replaying the events in his mind. For hours he had allowed anger to control him, to guide his actions and reactions, and it had nearly led him into conflict. Now, after facing someone who refused to be provoked, someone who handled the situation with calm authority and moral strength, he felt something shift inside himself. It wasn't easy for him to admit, not even to himself. Pride and ego had fueled his aggression for years, but now he felt a strange mix of humility and understanding. He realized that the confrontation had been more than just about the bar or the insults. It had been a mirror showing him who he really was and who he could be if he chose restraint over aggression. Meanwhile, the calm man walked out of the bar separately, feeling the night air brush against his face. He didn't feel victorious, nor did he feel relieved. He simply felt that he had done what was necessary. He had shown patience, integrity, and strength, without needing to prove anything. The night had been a test, and he had faced it with dignity, not for recognition, but because it was the right thing to do. Back inside, the bar staff quietly cleaned up, talking softly among themselves. "That was intense," one bartender said, shaking their head. "I've never seen someone handle a situation like that before. Most people would have fought back or yelled, but not him. He stayed calm the whole time." A patron sitting nearby nodded. "It's true. You could feel the tension shift just by his presence. The aggressive guy didn't know what to do. He thought he could control the situation, but someone showed him there's more power in control than in anger." The conversation continued quietly, each person reflecting on what had happened. It was clear that the events of the night had left a mark on everyone present. Some were thinking about how they would react in similar situations. Some were thinking about the value of patience and self-control, and some were thinking about the importance of moral courage, the ability to do what's right even when it's uncomfortable. Outside, the aggressive man finally stopped walking and leaned against a lamppost, taking a deep breath. The night was silent, almost peaceful, and yet his mind was alive with reflection. He thought about his own actions, about how easily anger had taken over, and about the lessons he had learned from the calm man's restraint. "I've been wrong," he muttered quietly, almost to himself. "I let anger control me, and it almost ruined everything. I can't let that happen again." It was a small moment, but it was powerful. The realization that he could choose a different path, that he could act with dignity and respect, was the first step toward change, and in that quiet moment, he felt a sense of relief. A relief that came from understanding that strength isn't about domination or aggression, but about the ability to stay composed, to make the right choice, even when it's difficult. The calm man, meanwhile, walked through the city streets observing the quiet night. He thought about the people in the bar, about how easily situations can escalate when anger and ego take over, and about how much impact one person can have by simply choosing restraint. It was a reminder of the power of human character, of patience, and of empathy. Back at the bar, the patrons began to talk more openly about the night's events. Some praised the calm man for his composure. Others discussed the aggressive man's journey from anger to reflection. The veterans who had intervened quietly reflected on the importance of community and support, realizing that sometimes the presence of others can prevent situations from spiraling out of control. One of the veterans spoke quietly to the bartender. "You never know what's going to happen in a place like this," they said. "But tonight we saw a lesson in human strength. Not the kind you throw with your fists, but the kind that stays calm, stays firm, and doesn't let hate or fear dictate actions." The bartender nodded, wiping a counter. "It's something I'll remember for a long time. It's not every night you see someone handle a dangerous situation with dignity and restraint. That's rare, and it changes how people see themselves and others." As the night wore on, the bar slowly emptied. Patrons left with thoughtful expressions, some smiling quietly, others lost in their own reflections. The lessons of the night had settled into their minds. The idea that human strength is not measured by dominance but by composure, that courage is often quiet, and that respect, once shown, can have a profound impact on others. Even the aggressive man walking home under the quiet glow of streetlights felt the weight of those lessons. He thought about how his actions had affected others, about how he could have handled things differently, and about the importance of self-control. For the first time in a long time, he considered the value of reflection over reaction, understanding over anger, and patience over impulsiveness. He realized that the night had given him an unexpected gift, the chance to see himself clearly, to understand the consequences of his actions, and to make a choice to do better moving forward. It wasn't an easy realization, but it was meaningful, and he carried it with him as he walked. The calm man, meanwhile, had reached his own home. He paused outside for a moment, thinking about the events of the night and the lessons that had unfolded. He didn't need recognition or praise. He knew that what mattered was the impact of his actions, the example he had set, and the quiet way he had demonstrated that dignity and restraint can change outcomes. That night, the city felt a little calmer, a little more thoughtful. The bar had returned to its usual rhythm, but the echoes of what had happened lingered. Patrons who had been present would remember the night for years, not for any act of violence, but for the display of human character, patience, and moral courage. The aggressive man eventually returned home, sitting quietly for a moment before he went to bed. He thought about how anger could have ruined the night, about how easily a fight could have escalated, and about the lesson he had learned, that true strength is in control, understanding, and respect. He resolved to carry that lesson forward, knowing it would not be easy, but understanding that it was worth the effort. In the end, the night wasn't about confrontation, nor was it about humiliation or fear. It was about reflection, about choices, and about the quiet power of doing the right thing when it's hard. The calm man had shown that one person could change the course of events not through violence, but through patience, dignity, and moral courage. And as the city slept, a quiet truth settled over those who had witnessed the night's events. Real strength is not in fists or threats, but in the ability to remain composed, to act with integrity, and to lead by example. That night had shown that in the face of aggression, in the face of anger, the most powerful response is often the simplest one: calm, measured, human, and kind. The aggressive man would remember it. The patrons would remember it. And the calm man, quietly reflecting on the night, would understand that his actions had made a difference. The story of that evening, though ordinary in setting, had become extraordinary in lesson, a lesson in courage, restraint, and the enduring impact of human character. By the next morning, the bar would reopen as usual and life would seem to return to normal. But for those who had been present, the events of the night would linger. The confrontation, the restraint, the moral courage, and the reflection had left a mark, one that could not be erased by time. It had become a story to remember, a reminder that sometimes the greatest victories are those that leave no bruises, no scars, but only lessons in the strength of the human spirit.